Hello, my dear friends. In the heart of Georgian London, thousands were quietly destroying themselves with a poison sold in every pharmacy, a medicine disguised as a miracle. Laudanum crept into bedrooms, nurseries, and parlors, consumed by the rich, the poor, women, men, and even infants. It dulled pain, blurred minds, and hollowed out bodies. Yet no one dared call it addiction. Families hid the bottles. Doctors kept prescribing, and society looked the other way as a century of silence engulfed its victims. Tonight, step inside this hidden world and witness the life of a laudanum addict. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background. And let's embark on this journey together tonight. If someone in Georgian London felt unwell, whether it was a lady sitting in her drawing room or a man coming home from the workshop, there was one bottle that seemed to be in every house. It was laudanum. People thought of it as medicine, not as poison. The tiny glass bottles were sold openly in shops across the city. It was so common that even people who had little money could afford a small dose. Laudanum was a mixture of alcohol and opium. It dulled pain, eased sleep, and silenced children. It was a solution for everything, and that was why it became part of daily life. Among the wealthy, laudanum was considered elegant. A lady of status might keep a bottle near her bedside or in a small cabinet by the dining room. When she felt nervous, dizzy, or simply bored, she would take a spoonful. The doctors of the time often told women that laudanum was good for calming the nerves. The women themselves came to believe that life without it was too difficult for them. The habit began as comfort. They might drink tea with friends in the afternoon and then excuse themselves to sip laudanum in private. No one thought badly of it. In fact, many thought it showed refinement. It is almost funny that what passed for elegance back then would today be compared to someone carrying a pocket full of painkillers everywhere they go. Workers also used laudanum. A man who spent all day lifting, hammering, or working by the river might come home with his muscles sore and his back in agony. He could not afford a long rest. He had to keep working the next day. Laudanum gave him temporary relief. He could drink a little before bed, sleep soundly, and wake up ready to force himself back to the same labor. For him, it was not about elegance or refinement. It was survival. Laudanum dulled the sharp pain and let him push through. The men who drank it did not call themselves addicts. They said they were just trying to keep their bodies moving long enough to feed their families. The use of laudanum did not stop with adults. Parents gave it to babies. A crying child was exhausting. And in homes where there were many children, constant crying meant no rest for anyone. Laudanum became a tool to silence infants. A few drops on the tongue could quiet a baby for hours. Bottles marketed directly for children even had soft names suggesting comfort and safety. Some were called soothing syrups. They promised peace in a noisy house. The reality was that babies were being drugged to sleep. Some survived it, others did not. Small bodies could not handle what adults were pouring into them. Yet parents trusted what was sold to them, and no one stopped the trade. If we compare it to now, it would be like walking into a modern pharmacy and seeing bottles of morphine syrup sitting on the shelf next to cough drops. The acceptance of laudanum across classes is striking. In one street, a wealthy woman in silk drank it for her nerves. In the same street, a dock worker used it to ease his aching bones. In another home, a baby was given drops so the family could sleep. No one thought of it as dangerous. Instead, it was praised. Newspapers carried advertisements. Apothecaries displayed bottles in their windows. Laudanum was everywhere in every circle, from the polished drawing rooms to the dim alleys. I cannot help but think that if I lived in that time, I too might have reached for it without questioning what it really was. This wide reach meant that laudanum was not hidden. People used it openly. Guests at a party might notice their hostess excusing herself to take a sip. A tired father might share with his friend that a few drops had helped him sleep despite his sore back. Mothers discussed how much they gave to their babies, comparing amounts like they were sharing recipes. The normalization of it erased any sense of caution. Addiction was not a word used in polite society. Weakness was the word they used. They believed some people simply had frail bodies that needed more rest. Laudanum, they thought, was a remedy, not a danger. The bottles themselves were easy to recognize, dark glass, carefully sealed and labeled with elegant lettering. Some were small enough to fit in a pocket. Others stood tall on the shelves of a grand home. They were not treated as shameful objects. They were placed next to other medicines, like powders for stomach aches or syrups for coughs. A visitor opening a cabinet might see them and think nothing of it. They were part of ordinary life. The cost was another reason for its popularity. Laudanum was cheaper than hiring a doctor for repeated visits. For a working family, one bottle could last weeks and serve many purposes. For a wealthy household, it was part of the regular supplies like tea or sugar. Everyone could reach it. Everyone could buy it. That kind of access meant that more and more people relied on it until it became normal to assume that life could not be managed without it. The city itself carried signs of its presence. Apothecaries thrived. Some streets had multiple shops selling bottles to whoever asked. There were no restrictions on age or reason. A child could walk in and buy it if they had the money. Vendors saw no harm in selling it to anyone. It was business. The demand was high and the supply kept growing. Georgian London learned to live with laudanum, not as a hidden vice, but as a visible habit. Over time, habits turned into needs. A woman who started taking laudanum for sleepless nights might discover she could no longer face the day without it. And so, what began as an occasional spoonful, a polite indulgence or a cheap remedy, could quietly become a daily necessity. One bottle turned into two, then into a shelf of them tucked discreetly into cabinets. People who had once told themselves they were only taking it for the pain of a headache, or to soothe a restless child, discovered that their mornings felt unbearable without a dose. The city, already humming with the noise of carts, bells, and river traffic, now carried an invisible undercurrent, the soft haze of countless minds dulled by laudanum. Doctors, too, played their role. They prescribed it liberally. In a world before antibiotics or reliable anesthesia, it seemed like a gift from nature itself. A patient with coughing fits might be sent home with laudanum drops. A mother grieving a lost child was advised to take it to help her sleep. Even physicians who suspected its dangers rarely spoke against it. To deny laudanum to a suffering patient would have seemed cruel. And so prescriptions piled up, not because doctors were blind, but because they had so little else to offer. Writers and thinkers of the age were not immune. A surprising number of poets, philosophers, and novelists leaned on the bottle. Their words filled with dreams, shadows, and strange wanderings sometimes betrayed the fog in which they lived. Opium fed their imaginations, even as it sapped their strength. There is a peculiar irony here. The same substance that dulled the aches of dockworkers also shaped the literature of the salons. The line between laborer and intellectual blurred when both reached for the same cure. And yet, society refused to call it what it was. Addiction was not a polite word. To admit dependence was to confess weakness, and weakness was not tolerated in Georgian London. Instead, families whispered about a relative's delicate constitution or fragile nerves. Bottles were moved quietly from cabinet to cabinet, hidden not out of shame for the drug itself, but to protect reputations. People did not condemn laudanum. They condemned those who, in their view, lacked the strength to control it, Apothecaries, meanwhile, thrived. The demand seemed endless. Their shop windows gleamed with neat rows of glass bottles, amber liquid catching the light like honey. The lettering on the labels was ornate, designed to inspire trust and respectability. Children peered in, seeing medicine, not menace. Housewives passed by, knowing that a few coins could buy peace for the evening. Men stopped in on their way home, slipping a bottle into a pocket before heading back to crowded rooms. The trade was steady, legal, and profitable. Step back for a moment and picture it. Georgian London, with its bustling markets, candlelit rooms, and gas lamps beginning to spread through the streets, all quietly steeped in the presence of this opiate. The poor drank it to survive their labor. The wealthy sipped it to maintain their composure. Infants swallowed it because their parents knew no better. It was not a scandal. It was normal life. But beneath this calm surface, lives were being eroded. Health failed. Minds dimmed. Families carried their hidden grief quietly, never daring to accuse the medicine itself. The silence lasted for decades, until eventually whispers grew louder, and the reality of laudanum's grip became harder to ignore. Imagine yourself walking through a London street in the late 18th century. The cobblestones are slick with recent rain, the air thick with smoke from countless chimneys, and the cries of vendors echo between narrow buildings. Somewhere nearby, a horse snorts impatiently as it pulls a cart. You pause before an apothecary's shop. The window display is orderly, reassuring. Rows of bottles in varying shapes and sizes stand like soldiers in formation, each carefully labeled with elegant script. There are powders for the stomach, syrups for the chest, and so very common that it almost disappears into the background, those dark bottles of laudanum. Inside, the shop smells of herbs, alcohol, and dust. Shelves line the walls, and a counter stands ready for transactions. A boy, hardly more than 12, hands over a few coins for a small vial. The apothecary does not question him. He might be buying it for his mother's headache, for his father's aching limbs, or simply because he has discovered in secret how warm and numb it makes him feel. The apothecary nods, slides the vial across the counter, and takes the boy's money. That is all. No laws forbid it. No doctor's note is required. In another home, across the city, a woman in silk gloves carefully measures out a spoonful. She closes her eyes as the bitterness coats her tongue. To her, this is not a vice, but a small, acceptable indulgence, no more questionable than a glass of wine after dinner. She believes it preserves her dignity, keeps her calm in the face of social demands, and helps her sleep in a house filled with obligations. When she returns to her friends in the parlor, no one suspects anything unusual. It is as much a part of her evening as the tea cooling in porcelain cups. The contrast is striking, yet it passes without comment. A dock worker in coarse clothes swallows his measure for paying. A wealthy hostess sips hers for composure. A father slips a few drops into a child's mouth so the household can rest. A student uses it to ease the stress of examinations. In each case, the bottle serves a different purpose, but always the same end, relief, however temporary. Even the bottles themselves became part of the scenery. Small vials rattled in drawers. Larger ones stood on shelves beside cough remedies and ointments. The labels carried names that suggested safety and gentleness. Soothing tincture, nervous cordial, resting draught. Elegant lettering gave the illusion of refinement. No one wanted to imagine that inside these graceful bottles was the same opium that sailors and smugglers carried in darker trades. The normalization of it is almost hard to grasp today. Picture a family table with bread, cheese, and a bottle of laudanum standing within reach. Not a shameful secret, just another household item. If the father's head ached, if the mother felt faint, if the child's crying went on too long, someone reached for the bottle. To them, it was not a risk. It was simply what you did. Over time, however, reliance grew. What began as occasional turned habitual. A spoonful at night became a spoonful in the afternoon as well. Those who once said they only needed it for headaches began to feel that daily life itself was unbearable without it. They did not use the word addiction, but the cycle was quietly tightening around them. London carried on. The carriages clattered, the markets buzzed, the theaters filled. But behind closed doors, more and more people leaned on the bottle to soften the edges of life. It was everywhere, it was ordinary, and it was silently altering the very rhythm of society. Silence is a curious thing. In Georgian London, silence did not always mean ignorance. Often, it meant agreement. When it came to laudanum, the city seemed to choose not to see. Families did not confront the habit. They simply accommodated it. A woman who excused herself from a gathering to take a spoonful was not judged. If anything, it was considered discreet, even genteel. Neighbors noticed the bottles in one another's cabinets, but they rarely spoke of them. Silence kept everything respectable. Doctors, too, upheld this quiet acceptance. A physician arriving at a wealthy home might observe the bottles by the bedside and say nothing. Why would he? He had likely prescribed them himself. And if the family believed the lady of the house had weak nerves or a delicate frame, then laudanum was seen as the natural, even enlightened, remedy. The idea that she might be dependent upon it, that her shaking hands and tired eyes were signs of something more sinister, was left unspoken. A doctor's role in that society was often to reassure rather than to challenge. Newspapers carried their share of advertisements, thinly veiled as notices of trust. Laudanum was praised for its remarkable effectiveness against coughs, colic, sleeplessness, and even vague complaints like melancholy or nervous agitation. The words were chosen carefully, comforting, persuasive, never alarming. One could hardly open a paper without seeing some variation of these promises. If society at large was willing to print and praise it, why should an ordinary reader question what they had always been told? And then there were the shops. An apothecary's window, bright with polished glass and neat rows, was not a place of scandal. People went in and out as casually as one might step into a bakery. You might see a gentleman picking up a large bottle for his household, or a servant sent to fetch a smaller one for the nursery. It was routine. If there was any shame, it was not in buying laudanum, but in failing to appear in control of one's health. Even within families, silence reigned. A husband might notice his wife was using more than she once did, but he would explain it away. She was frail, she was tired. She was under stress reasons that fit neatly within social expectations. A mother might know that she herself had begun to rely on the bottle more heavily, but she would never say it aloud. To admit reliance was to admit weakness, and weakness had no place in polite conversation. It is strange to think how entire neighborhoods could be steeped in this habit without ever speaking of it. Behind lace curtains, bottles were measured, spoons were lifted, children were given drops. And yet the streets outside rang with the same noise of carriages and hawkers, as though nothing unusual was happening. Society carried on, balanced on a quiet agreement that laudanum was normal, acceptable, even necessary. This silence was not simply the absence of words. It was a form of protection. By not naming the problem, by not calling it addiction, people shielded themselves from scandal. They could believe, at least for a little while longer, that they were not enslaved by the bottle in the cabinet. They were merely managing life as best they could. If laudanum was everywhere in London homes, it was also everywhere in London minds. It was not only the poor and the weary who reached for it, but also those whose words would echo far beyond their lifetimes. Writers, poets, and thinkers, those who shaped culture itself, often found themselves under its influence. Perhaps the most famous among them was Thomas de Quincey, a young man of restless intellect who discovered laudanum at the turn of the 19th century. He took it first, as so many did, to ease pain. But soon he found in it not only relief but visions. He later wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a book that revealed the hidden world of the laudanum habit. His words drifted between the exalted and the nightmarish, the warmth and the calm, but also the creeping terrors that followed when the bottle's comfort turned into a chain. De Quincey's account shocked some of his readers, fascinated others, and gave language to an experience that many preferred to keep in silence. But even he was not shunned for his dependence. Instead, his confessions became part of the literary culture, almost romanticized. His pain became entertainment, his weakness transformed into art. And so, even in exposure, laudanum maintained its respectability. He was not alone. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, the poet of Kubla Khan and the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, was also ensnared. He began with laudanum to soothe his ailments, to quiet his restless mind. But it clung to him, shaping his days, clouding his friendships, and staining his creativity with both brilliance and despair. The dreamlike visions that filled his poetry owed something to the bottle. So, too, did the fog that consumed his later years. These were not dock workers or mothers in crowded houses. They were men of letters, admired and respected. And yet the same dark liquid flowed through their veins. Laudanum was the equalizer. It linked the worn hands of laborers with the ink-stained fingers of poets. It blurred the line between necessity and indulgence, between survival and escape. Doctors, too, were not untouched. Many who prescribed it also partook of it. Their medical bags often carried vials for patients, but also for themselves. Pain, after all, was no respecter of knowledge. A physician might assure a mother that laudanum would ease her child's rest, and then return home to measure a dose for his own aching joints. In that world, authority and dependency lived side by side, with little contradiction. Step into the parlor of a respectable home, and you might find a guest excusing himself not to cough or to rest, but to take his private measure of laudanum. Step into a scholar's study, and you might see the same bottle beside his books, its presence as unremarkable as an inkstand. Step into a nursery, and there again it waited, measured out in drops for the restless child. The same substance threaded through every room of society's house. It is tempting, from our distance, to judge, to say they should have known, should have stopped, should have seen the danger. But when we step back into their world, where pain was constant, medicine uncertain, and death never far, becomes easier to understand. To them, laudanum was not a scandal. It was a solution. And so, even the greatest minds of the age surrendered to it quietly, as naturally as one might surrender to sleep. Consider, for a moment, the women of Georgian and Victorian London. They were told repeatedly that their bodies were fragile. Doctors spoke of hysteria, of nerves, of female weakness. The language itself encouraged dependence, for it suggested that women required constant soothing, constant management of their emotions and health. And what better, more convenient remedy than a dark bottle that promised peace? Laudanum became the quiet companion of countless women, especially those in the middle and upper classes. A fashionable lady might keep a bottle in her boudoir, nestled among powders and perfumes. She might take a spoonful before a dinner party to steady her trembling hands. Another sip might follow at night, when thoughts kept her awake or loneliness pressed too heavily against her heart. No one questioned it. In fact, her use of laudanum confirmed what society already believed, that she was delicate, refined, in need of constant care. For poorer women, the story was harsher. A mother with several children, an exhausted body, and a husband working long hours might find laudanum to be her only ally. A small bottle could be stretched to last for weeks. A few drops could silence a crying infant. A spoonful could grant her, for once, an unbroken night of sleep. It was cheaper than a doctor, quicker than prayer, and easier than asking for help that never came. Yet it was also merciless. Small doses blurred into larger ones, and what began as relief became necessity. Children, tragically, were among the most frequent recipients. Entire products were marketed for them, with names like soothing syrup or Godfrey's cordial. These mixtures, heavily laced with opium, promised to quiet babies for hours on end. Parents trusted the labels, trusted the apothecaries, and above all, trusted the silence that followed. The cries stopped. The household rested. But tiny bodies cannot bear what grown bodies tolerate. Infants slipped into sleep that was deeper than safe. Some never woke again. Records from coroners' reports tell of unexplained infant deaths, and yet society rarely blamed the bottle. Instead, explanations were softened. A weak constitution, a fever, fate. It is easy, from our distance, to imagine shock or outrage. But in their world, laudanum was not considered dangerous. It was respectable. When mothers gathered, they might even exchange notes on how much to give a child, just as they compared recipes for bread or methods for sewing. Imagine a conversation in a modest kitchen, two women discussing not whether to use laudanum, but how many drops seemed best for their little ones. The casual tone concealed the gravity of what was being passed down, not merely advice, but dependence. Fathers, too, leaned on the bottle. After a day of punishing labor hauling goods along the docks, hammering iron in forges, carrying endless loads through narrow alleys, a man's body was worn to its limits. Rest was a luxury. Tomorrow demanded more work, and pain could not be allowed to linger. Laudanum, cheap and effective, dulled the ache enough to allow him to rise again. He did not think of it as indulgence. He thought of it as survival. In his eyes, the difference between taking the drops and not taking them was the difference between feeding his family and failing them. Even children old enough to walk and talk were not untouched. A boy with a persistent cough might be dosed nightly, his lungs quieted by opium syrup. A girl with stomach pains might be soothed with a teaspoonful. Families did not see it as a risk. They saw it as compassion. The child slept soundly, the household breathed easier, and the bottle went back on the shelf, ready for its next use. And all the while, silence persisted. Doctors who noticed patterns, women wasting away, children who failed to thrive, men who grew dependent rarely spoke of laudanum as the cause. Instead, they reached for words like weakness, melancholy, or natural decline. To name the drug as the problem would have been to challenge the entire structure of society's trust in medicine. Easier, far easier, to accept the silence. If you imagine London in those years, you must picture not just the carriages rattling over cobblestones or the gas lamps glowing in fog, but also the hidden rhythm of the city, drops falling into cups, spoons clinking softly against glass, bitter liquid swallowed in parlors, kitchens, and nurseries. Each household, rich or poor, found its own justification. Each life bent itself quietly around the bottle. This was not scandal. This was normal. And it was in this quiet normality that the true power of laudanum lay. Not in the dramatic ruin of a single life, but in the slow erosion of countless lives, lived under its shadow, yet spoken of in whispers, or not at all. In Georgian and Victorian London, laudanum did not hide in the shadows. It stood proudly in the shop windows, its presence polished and respectable. If you imagine walking down a busy street, your eyes might catch advertisements pasted on walls or printed in newspapers, bold words promising relief from sleeplessness, from coughs, from nervous agitation. These notices were not warnings. They were invitations. The language was gentle, persuasive. Laudanum was described as a soothing cordial, a faithful companion in times of weariness. Advertisements promised not only health, but also dignity. To buy a bottle was not to confess weakness, it was to join in a modern, enlightened solution. In an age where medicine was still uncertain, This little vial seemed like progress itself, packaged neatly and sold for a modest price. For the wealthy, laudanum even carried a faint air of fashion. To keep a bottle in one's cabinet was almost a mark of refinement, a sign that one cared for health and composure. Visitors who glimpsed it did not whisper in scandal. They nodded in understanding. To be seen using laudanum was no more disreputable than being seen with a cup of tea. In some circles, it even suggested one was cultured, delicate, attuned to the finer demands of life. The bottles themselves were designed to inspire trust. Dark glass, elegant lettering, and ornate labels gave the appearance of authority. A casual glance would place them among other medicines, perhaps indistinguishable from cough syrups or digestive powders. The design was deliberate, to reassure, to blend in, to make the extraordinary seem ordinary. And it worked. The bottle became a quiet fixture of the home, as much a part of daily supplies as sugar, bread, or candles. Newspapers helped carry this message further, alongside reports of politics, shipping, and markets. One might find advertisements extolling the virtues of a particular brand of laudanum. Readers absorbed these notices as they sipped their morning tea. The words promised not only relief, but also social approval. Everyone used it, and therefore so should you. The repetition of this message, week after week, softened any doubts. If society praised it, if the papers printed it, then surely there was nothing to fear. Even literature, in subtle ways, echoed this acceptance. Poets and novelists, themselves often under laudanum's influence, wrote of dreamlike visions, of quiet despair, of softened realities. Their readers consumed these works, not realizing that the same substance sat in their own cupboards. The link between creativity and laudanum was not openly acknowledged, but it drifted through the culture, shaping both art and daily life. The absence of public condemnation was as striking as the presence of praise. No pamphlets cried out against its dangers. No sermons thundered from pulpits warning of its hold. Instead, silence ruled, broken only by the hum of commerce and the rustle of advertisements. Society as a whole seemed to lean gently in favor of the bottle. If one pauses to think, it is almost uncanny. An entire city, across all classes and professions, carrying the same secret habit, and yet not treating it as a secret at all. It was visible, it was celebrated, and it was normalized until it seemed less like a medicine and more like a quiet necessity of life. Laudanum had become not only a cure, but a culture. And cultures, once established, are not easily questioned. There is something almost uncanny about how laudanum existed in Georgian and Victorian London. It was not hidden in back alleys, nor sold under whispers. It was everywhere, visible to anyone who cared to look. And yet, in another sense, it was invisible, because people chose not to see it as dangerous. The mystery of laudanum's power was not only in the drug itself, but in the silence that grew around it. Think of the newspapers. They printed advertisements filled with promises of calm and relief. A mother, weary with sleepless nights, could read of a cordial that would soothe her baby. A gentleman plagued with headaches might learn of a tincture that would ease his pain. These words, repeated again and again in bold print, wrapped laudanum in a cloak of respectability. The very fact that it appeared in the press, beside news of Parliament and shipping schedules, gave it legitimacy. It was not contraband. It was modern, trusted, civilized. Apothecaries knew this well. Their shops, with their neat jars and gleaming counters, were temples of reassurance. To walk into one was to step into a world of knowledge and safety, where powders and potions promised to steady the unpredictable body. And there, always within easy reach, was laudanum. It was not pushed, not hidden. It simply waited, as ordinary as a jar of peppermints, as accessible as a candle or a loaf of bread. Doctors spoke of it with authority, and yet often with vagueness. They called it a remedy for nervous conditions, for female frailty, for general debility. These words were elastic, stretching to fit almost any complaint. A patient who could not sleep was given laudanum. A patient who coughed too often was given laudanum. A patient who wept or worried or ached found the same solution. The mystery here lies not in the substance itself. It was always opium, dissolved in alcohol, but in the way society explained it. To call it by vague names, to describe it as necessary, was to disguise its grip. There was, too, an unspoken rule. It was impolite to question another's use. If a hostess slipped away during a dinner party, her guests pretended not to notice the faint smell of alcohol and bitterness when she returned. If a father confessed to a friend that laudanum helped him sleep, the friend nodded sympathetically, perhaps even asked for the name of the apothecary. Politeness, that prized virtue of London society, became another layer of silence. Even death did not break the illusion. Infants who slipped away after being dosed with soothing syrup were mourned, but their deaths were rarely attributed to the drops. Women who grew frail and pale were said to have consumptive tendencies. Men who weakened were said to have been overworked. Laudanum was the ever-present companion, but rarely the accused. It was not seen as the culprit. It was seen as a comfort, right up until the end. This was the greatest mystery of all, how an entire society could live so intimately with a poison, and yet rarely admit its danger. Respectability, politeness, and habit all conspired to create a silence so deep that the truth could barely be spoken. Medicine, in the 18th and 19th centuries, was as much performance as science. Physicians wore their black coats and carried their polished bags, symbols of learning and authority. Patients trusted them not only for cures, but for reassurance that their ailments were understood, and that modern knowledge could provide relief. Laudanum fit this image perfectly. It was easy to prescribe, easy to sell, easy to believe in. When a doctor handed a small bottle to a patient, he was not simply offering a liquid. He was offering confidence, control over uncertainty. Pain, sleeplessness, coughing, these had always been stubborn enemies. Now, here was something that subdued them, quickly and reliably. For the public, laudanum was not a dangerous drug. It was the emblem of medicine's progress. This trust was reinforced by appearances. The bottles were dark, elegant, and clearly labeled. They bore the names of reputable apothecaries, some of whom had served noble households for generations. To hold such a bottle was to hold a piece of respectability itself. It was nothing like the rough substances of the street. No crude powders passed hand to hand in secret. Laudanum came from a shop with polished windows, from a man in an apron who measured it carefully. It was refined, civilized. Even the language surrounding laudanum elevated it. Doctors spoke of tinctures, cordials, draughts. These words softened the reality, transforming opium and alcohol into something almost poetic. A cordial for the nerves sounded reassuring, even gentle. And so, patients who might have balked at swallowing raw opium trusted its diluted cousin, because it arrived under a more graceful name. The mystery lies in how little people questioned. Even when the signs were clear, women fading into fragility, men who could not work without their dose, children who slept unnaturally long, society resisted drawing the connection. To question laudanum was to question the authority of medicine itself. To doubt not only the apothecaries, but the very idea that progress was possible. Better to believe in the bottle. Better to accept its promises, however costly, than to admit that the remedy might be worse than the ailment. It was this trust, this faith in medicine's veneer, that allowed laudanum to spread so deeply. Pain was conquered, or so it seemed. Sleepless nights were calmed. Infants were soothed. And London could reassure itself that it was living in a modern age, enlightened and advanced. Behind that reassurance, lives slipped quietly into dependency. But as long as the apothecary's window shone respectably, as long as the advertisements promised safety, the illusion of progress remained intact. One of the strangest truths about laudanum was how it blurred the lines of class. In Georgian and Victorian London, distinctions between rich and poor were everywhere visible in clothes, in houses, in manners, even in the way people walked down the street. And yet, when it came to laudanum, those divisions faded. The same bitter liquid flowed into cups of porcelain and mugs of pewter, into the mouths of infants wrapped in lace, and those swaddled in rags. A lady of wealth might sip a measured spoonful in her boudoir, convinced it was the mark of refinement. A dock worker might swallow from the same bottle in a cramped room, desperate for sleep after a day of breaking his back. To each, the substance meant something different: elegance for one, survival for the other. And yet, the result was the same: a growing reliance, quiet and unspoken. This universality was both remarkable and dangerous. It meant that laudanum carried no stigma because it belonged to everyone. The wealthy did not sneer at the poor for using it. The poor did not resent the wealthy for indulging. Instead, both groups could look at each other and say silently, "Yes, I understand." It was perhaps one of the only habits that crossed London's rigid social barriers without challenge. Imagine walking down a street in 1800. In one grand townhouse, a hostess excuses herself from her guests, retreating to a side room where a glass bottle waits beside the silver candlesticks. In the same street, through a narrow alley, a laborer limps home and uncorks his own vial, cheaper and smaller, but no less potent. And in a cramped tenement, a mother gives her child a few drops, grateful for the sudden silence that settles over the room. Different houses, different classes, one habit binding them all together. This shared illusion that laudanum was normal, safe, even necessary, created a powerful silence. If everyone used it, then surely it could not be wrong. If the wealthy carried it with elegance, then surely the poor were justified in using it for survival. And if infants could be dosed with soothing syrups without scandal, then surely adults could be excused as well. The city itself seemed built on this quiet agreement. Apothecaries flourished not only in fashionable districts, but also in working-class neighborhoods. Bottles passed as casually as bread or coal. There was no divide in who could access it. Respectability shielded the rich. Necessity shielded the poor. And so laudanum's grip tightened, hidden not by secrecy, but by acceptance. This is perhaps the greatest irony. In a city so conscious of class and reputation, laudanum became the one thing that truly united everyone. Not through joy, not through celebration, but through quiet dependence on a bitter liquid that dulled both pain and clarity. For decades, London floated in its quiet haze of laudanum, a city lulled by drops and spoonfuls. Yet even the thickest silence cannot hold forever. Slowly, cracks began to show. There were the overdoses, whispered about but never proclaimed. A child put to sleep too heavily and never woke again. A woman who, in her despair, measured more than her usual dose and slipped into a sleep from which she did not return. A laborer who, after one spoonful too many, staggered and collapsed. These deaths did not ignite outrage. They were softened, folded into other explanations: weak hearts, wasting fevers, nervous decline. Families, unwilling to admit the truth even to themselves, buried their dead with bowed heads and said little more. There were scandals, too, though few reached the newspapers. A gentleman discovered insensible in his study, bottles still uncorked beside him. A hostess who slurred her words too heavily at a dinner party, her refined mask slipping before her guests. These moments might have been laughed off, explained away, or buried in silence. Society preferred not to stain reputations with something so unmentionable as dependency. Better to mutter about illness than to admit the obvious. And yet, among physicians and apothecaries, unease began to stir. They could not ignore the patterns forever. Patients returned more often, demanding larger quantities. Men who once took a teaspoonful now required two. Women who claimed only to need it at night began requesting bottles weekly. The apothecaries saw their profits grow, but some also saw the shadow of a problem they did not yet know how to name. Medical journals occasionally hinted at it. A cautious article might note that too much laudanum could be dangerous, that the body could come to depend on it. But these warnings were buried in professional circles, rarely making their way to the public. And even when they did, the public preferred not to hear. After all, what else was there? In a world without modern painkillers, without antibiotics, without anesthesia, laudanum seemed like a gift too precious to surrender. The irony was sharp. The very substance that symbolized progress, refinement, and trust in modern medicine was also quietly undermining health, families, and minds. The illusion persisted because it was useful to apothecaries, useful to doctors, useful to households desperate for relief. To question laudanum was to question the foundations of daily life. Few dared. And so London carried on, even as the cracks widened. The city's streets bustled with trade, theaters lit their stages, drawing rooms glittered with candlelight, and behind it all, bottles of laudanum waited on shelves, tucked into bags, slipped into pockets. They were still bought, still used, still praised. The silence endured, but it was no longer whole. Whispers had begun. This was the great paradox of laudanum in Georgian and Victorian society. It was both a symbol of progress and a hidden poison, both elegant and destructive, both ordinary and fatal. And for decades, London balanced on this contradiction, unwilling or perhaps unable to see the truth clearly. In Georgian and Victorian London, class was everything. It shaped the clothes you wore, the food you ate, the air you breathed, and even the streets you walked. The city was a patchwork of contrasts, gilded drawing rooms and crumbling tenements standing within a few streets of one another. And yet, when it came to laudanum, these two worlds touched in a way they rarely did elsewhere. For the wealthy, laudanum was draped in elegance. It was kept in cabinets of polished wood, beside bottles of French wine and porcelain cups of imported tea. A lady might call for it discreetly, her maid fetching the vial as naturally as she might fetch a fan. A few drops before bed, a spoonful during an anxious afternoon, these were seen not as vices, but as small necessities of refinement. Doctors encouraged it, reinforcing the idea that women of delicate nerves required such comforts. To be a nervous lady was not shameful. It was, in some strange way, fashionable. Among the poor, the picture was harsher. In cramped rooms where whole families shared a single hearth, laudanum was not a refinement, but a tool. A laborer's aching muscles demanded rest he could not afford. A mother with too many mouths to feed could not endure endless nights of crying. A bottle, purchased cheaply from the apothecary, became a survival strategy. It dulled pain, silenced noise, bought a few hours of sleep in lives where exhaustion was constant. The differences were clear, and yet the similarities were deeper. Both the lady in silk and the man in rags reached for the same bitter liquid. Both trusted it. Both wove it into their daily lives. For one, it preserved appearances. For the other, it preserved strength. But both walked the same road of reliance, though society pretended otherwise. The contrast was also visible in how people spoke of laudanum. In polite drawing rooms, it was referred to with gentle euphemisms. Nervous drops, a cordial for the spirits. In alleys and workshops, it was spoken of more bluntly, as relief for aches, as something that got you through the day. Yet whether cloaked in elegance or spoken of plainly, the substance was the same. Children, too, were caught in both worlds. A wealthy nursemaid might dose a restless baby with a soothing syrup while the mother hosted guests. A poor mother in a crowded room might do the same, desperate for a moment of quiet. The children, rich or poor, swallowed the same drops. The dangers did not discriminate. This was laudanum's peculiar power. It transcended barriers that otherwise seemed immovable. It blurred the sharp line between rich and poor, between refinement and survival. Everyone used it, but each class clothed the habit in different words, different justifications. And so, while London loudly proclaimed its divisions, between silk and soot, between drawing rooms and alleys, the quiet truth was that the same poison threaded through them all, binding the city together in dependence. Step into a theater on a foggy evening. The gaslights glow, the crowd murmurs, the actors wait behind the curtain. Among the audience, some shift restlessly in their seats, while others sit in perfect calm. A woman in pearls has taken a measured spoonful before leaving her house. Her laughter seems effortless, her posture serene. Beside her, a gentleman who has struggled with headaches all week sits unusually relaxed, his discomfort dulled by a few drops from the same bitter liquid. Their composure, admired by others, is not wholly their own. It has been purchased from the apothecary, now slip into a tavern, darker and rougher. The air smells of smoke, spilled ale, and damp wool. Dock workers and carters crowd around tables, their voices hoarse from long days of labor. Here, too, the influence of laudanum is present, though it looks less polished. A man who drank heavily the night before takes a small vial from his pocket, mixing a dose with beer to calm his stomach. Another, coughing from years by the river, swallows a spoonful to quiet his lungs long enough to finish his meal. No one remarks on it. The tavern keeper himself may have done the same that morning. In the parlors of respectable homes, laudanum often appeared in subtler forms. A hostess might vanish briefly during an evening of conversation, returning with a calm smile that concealed her frayed nerves. A guest might notice the faint tongue of alcohol on her breath, but politely look away. A servant, sent to fetch more wine, might pass by a cabinet where the bottle stood half empty, its elegant label glowing faintly in the lamplight. These were not scandals. They were ordinary scenes, unnoticed because they were so common. Even in workplaces, laudanum made its quiet appearances. A clerk, bent over ledgers until his eyes blurred, might take a drop to push through the day. A seamstress, pricking her fingers in dim light, might do the same. In factories where machinery clattered and bodies strained, men kept bottles tucked into their coats. No law forbade it, no overseer protested. If anything, employers benefited. Laudanum allowed weary workers to endure conditions that might otherwise break them. Public spaces carried traces of laudanum, not because it was flaunted, but because it was everywhere. It softened the edges of evenings at the theater, helped men survive their hours in taverns, steadied women in parlors, and drove weary clerks to finish their accounts. It was not spoken of openly, but it was never far away. The great illusion was that laudanum belonged only to private life, hidden in cabinets and bedside tables. In truth, it moved with people wherever they went. It walked with them into theaters, into taverns, into shops and offices. It shaped the city's rhythm not only behind closed doors, but also in its public spaces, smoothing tempers, dulling pains, and silencing questions. And still, silence reigned. Inside the family home, laudanum's presence was both ordinary and deeply intimate. It touched the daily rhythm of life, shaping not only health, but reputation. Families learned to live with the bottle as though it were another member of the household, always there, always needed, rarely spoken of. In the homes of the wealthy, laudanum was wrapped in discretion. A lady might excuse herself from the drawing room, retreating to her chamber where a polished cabinet held her supply. She returned a few minutes later, her hands steadier, her smile smoother, her voice softer. Her guests saw only composure. If they suspected her habit, they politely avoided the subject. Reputation was too delicate to be bruised by questions. Her family, meanwhile, might refer to her nerves or her delicate constitution. These phrases concealed as much as they revealed. They allowed dependency to hide under a cloak of refinement. Among working families, laudanum was no less present, though less disguised. In a cramped tenement, a mother might reach for the bottle in plain sight of her children, tipping drops onto a spoon for herself or for an infant. Neighbors, hearing the sudden silence of a once crying baby, would not gasp in horror, they would nod in understanding. Everyone knew the exhaustion of endless nights, and everyone knew the bottle was the cheapest way to buy peace. Reputation mattered here too, but in a different way. A mother was judged not for giving laudanum, but for failing to quiet her children at all. For fathers, the story was similar. A gentleman might sip laudanum discreetly before an evening at his club, presenting himself as calm and urbane. A laborer, meanwhile, might take it openly after supper, explaining to his children that it eased his back enough to rise again in the morning. Both were, in their own eyes, fulfilling their roles. One maintaining the dignity expected of his station, the other ensuring he could continue to work. Children, tragically, were caught in both worlds. In a wealthy nursery, a nursemaid might administer soothing syrup to ensure the household's quiet. In a poorer home, parents did the same, grateful for even a few hours of rest. Families did not see this as cruelty. They saw it as responsibility. A restless child disturbed the order of the home, and laudanum promised order in a single drop. Reputation, however, was fragile. In wealthy households, whispers sometimes spread when a woman grew too thin, too pale, too dependent. Her neighbors might speak of her weakness, careful never to call it what it was. In poorer families, too much reliance could brand a mother as careless, or a father as feeble. And yet, these judgments were rarely harsh. Why? Because everyone, in some way, was touched by the same habit. Silence softened the edges of criticism. Thus, laudanum shaped not only bodies but identities. A woman was delicate. A man was weary. A child was quiet. These roles were reinforced by the drops measured out from a bottle no one dared to condemn. Families clung to their reputations, adjusting language, adjusting expectations, but never truly adjusting their dependence. In the end, whether in a grand townhouse or a crowded tenement, laudanum became part of what it meant to be a respectable family in London. Respectable, not because it was hidden, but because it was accepted. And that acceptance allowed the habit to pass quietly from one generation to the next. By the middle of the 19th century, London itself seemed to pulse with laudanum. It was not only in the cabinets of homes or in the pockets of workers, it was in the very structure of the city, woven into commerce, reputation, and daily routine. Apothecaries thrived in every district. In wealthy neighborhoods, their shops gleamed with polished glass, ornate lettering, and promises of refinement. In poorer quarters, their shelves held smaller bottles, plain but potent, measured out to the penny. The trade was universal, feeding every corner of society. The same ships that carried opium across oceans to London. Stocks supplied both the elegant parlors of Mayfair and the alleys of Whitechapel. Commerce did not discriminate. Money changed hands, bottles changed owners, and dependency grew behind both polished doors and broken ones. The culture of medicine adapted to this reality. Doctors spoke of laudanum as though it were a necessary instrument, as natural as a scalpel or a stethoscope. Families relied on it, and so doctors prescribed it. The cycle reinforced itself. Society came to expect that every ailment, whether a noblewoman's sleeplessness or a factory worker's cough, would be met with the same dark remedy. In this way, laudanum blurred the boundaries between classes, not by erasing them, but by building a bridge of shared need. Even London's public identity was touched. Newspapers and journals continued to print advertisements, smoothing over doubts with phrases like soothing relief and trusted cordial. Respectability hung on words. A wealthy man reading his paper might nod approvingly at an advertisement for the very substance he had taken the night before. A laborer might read the same line by candlelight and feel justified in his own use. The city, in its printed voice, assured them both that they were doing nothing wrong. What is striking when we step back is how society bent itself around this quiet dependency. Families adjusted their language, calling it weakness, frailty, nerves, rather than naming addiction. Shops adjusted their trade, keeping laudanum as a staple stock beside bread and soap. Doctors adjusted their practice, writing prescriptions with little hesitation. Even religion, so often quick to condemn vice, largely fell silent. Sermons thundered against gin and gambling, but laudanum escaped their wrath. It was too ordinary, too respectable, too ingrained. In the end, London became a city united by division. Rich and poor lived vastly different lives, separated by wealth, status, and opportunity. Yet beneath those differences, they shared the same quiet habit, the same reliance, the same bottle. The lady in silk and the man in rags did not walk the same streets, but both, before bed, lifted the same dark liquid to their lips. And so, laudanum was not only a medicine or a habit. It was a social glue, invisible yet binding. It blurred class, blurred language, blurred morality. The city continued to hum and bustle, proud of its progress, blind to its fragility. For in its cabinets and cupboards, in its taverns and theaters, in its nurseries and sick rooms, London carried a poison it had taught itself to call medicine. For decades, London lived as though laudanum were an invisible companion, always present, rarely questioned. But silence cannot hold forever. By the middle of the 19th century, whispers began to break through the stillness. The world was changing. Medicine, law, and public opinion were shifting, and laudanum could no longer remain untouchable. The first signs came from medicine itself. Doctors, who had once prescribed laudanum without hesitation, began to notice patterns they could no longer ignore. Patients who returned again and again, demanding more. Women who could not sleep without it. Men who could not work without it. Children who wasted away in homes where soothing syrups were poured too freely. In the pages of medical journals, cautious words began to appear. Warnings of habit, of dependence, of dangers in excess. These were not yet the sharp words of condemnation, but they were cracks in the wall of respectability. There were also scandals, small at first, then louder. A child's death attributed, for once, not to vague frailty, but to an overdose of soothing syrup. A prominent gentleman discovered in a stupor, his secret revealed in public. A poet's confession, printed in black and white, laying bare the strange dreams and terrible despair that laudanum brought. These stories stirred unease. What had long been considered normal now began to look, in certain lights, alarming. Society, too, was shifting. The industrial city was louder, faster, harder than before. Reformers raised their voices against unsafe factories, against child labor, against filthy streets. And in this wave of social concern, some began to question medicine itself. Was it right to dose infants with opium? Was it safe to hand bottles across counters to anyone with a coin? The questions were tentative, but they grew louder with each passing decade. Even the law stirred. In the mid-19th century, early regulations on poisons began to appear. Apothecaries were required, at least in some cases, to label bottles with warnings. Stronger measures followed in time, as the link between opium and death became undeniable. Laudanum was not banned, not yet, but it was no longer entirely free. Society had taken its first steps away from blind trust. And yet, the change was slow. For every doctor who warned against it, another continued to prescribe it freely. For every article that raised alarm, advertisements still promised comfort. For every scandal, a dozen households continued quietly as before, measuring drops into cups and spoons. Old habits die hard, especially when they are habits that span generations. The awakening, then, was not sudden. It was a long, uneven process, stretching across decades. But it had begun, and once begun, it could not be stopped. By the latter half of the 19th century, the facetae around laudanum had thinned. What had once been considered a universal remedy was beginning to look like something more troubling. Doctors, reformers, and ordinary families could no longer ignore the patterns. Dependence had become too common, the tragedies too frequent, the silence too heavy. Medical journals spoke more plainly. Where once they had hinted at nervous weakness, they now wrote of habitual use and dangerous reliance. The word addiction itself had not yet taken root in popular speech, but the idea was forming. Physicians warned of patients who could not function without their daily doses. Case studies described women wasting away, men unable to work, children slipping into death. These accounts were written not as moral judgments, but as clinical observations. The language of medicine was slowly catching up to reality. The law, too, grew firmer. Regulations required apothecaries to keep closer control of their sales. Some bottles bore clearer labels, marked as poison or dangerous in large quantities. Customers could still buy laudanum, but the effortless freedom of earlier decades was gone. A shadow of caution now accompanied the purchase. It was no longer quite as ordinary to slip a bottle into one's pocket. Public opinion shifted unevenly. In polite society, laudanum still lingered in cabinets, but it was spoken of less openly. Dependence, once softened as weakness, now risked being called something harsher. A lady who had relied too heavily on her nervous drops might find herself whispered about at gatherings. A gentleman who staggered at his club under the drug's influence might face embarrassment rather than sympathy. Respectability no longer shielded the habit as it once had. Among the poor, the story was grimmer still. Laudanum had long been a cheap alternative to medical care, but as regulation increased, prices crept higher. Some families could no longer afford as much, forcing them to choose between enduring pain or paying for relief. Others continued as before, still dosing infants with syrups, still swallowing spoonfuls after exhausting work, still trapped by necessity. Reform did not erase suffering. It only shifted the terms. Literature, once a quiet accomplice, began to speak more openly. Writers described the nightmares of dependence, the hallucinations, the despair. De Quincey's confessions remained widely read, but now they were joined by sharper voices, less romantic, more damning. The dreamlike haze of laudanum, once admired for its strange visions, now carried the unmistakable odor of ruin. And yet, for all this change, laudanum did not disappear. It could not yet. Medicine still had few alternatives. Pain was real, sleeplessness was real, and laudanum still answered both, even as it deepened its grip. Society had begun to name the danger, but it had not yet found a way to replace the drug itself. This was the paradox of the late 19th century. London had awakened, but only partly. It could no longer pretend laudanum was harmless, but it could not let it go. The silence was broken, yet the habit endured. Families still measured drops. Doctors still prescribed. Apothecaries still sold. Change was underway, but dependency remained, quieter now, but no less powerful. By the final decades of the 19th century, laudanum's hold over London was weakening. Not gone, not forgotten, but no longer the unquestioned remedy it had once been. Change was creeping in from every direction, medicine, law, and culture all conspiring to move society away from its long reliance. The world of medicine had grown sharper. New discoveries were transforming the practice. Anesthetics like chloroform and ether gave doctors ways to manage pain in surgery. Antibiotics were still decades away, but antiseptics were beginning to save lives, and quinine promised relief from malaria. Slowly, the medical profession expanded its arsenal, and laudanum was no longer the only universal answer. Doctors who once prescribed it reflexively now reached for alternatives when they could. The law pressed harder, too. The Pharmacy Act of 1868 in Britain required opium preparations to be sold only by licensed chemists, and only with proper records. Labels grew sterner, bottles bore clear warnings, and sales to children were finally restricted. Laudanum was still legal, still widely available, but the days of a child walking freely into a shop with a coin were over. The silence that had sheltered the trade for so long was crumbling under regulation. Public perception shifted as well. Once, to see a bottle on a shelf had been a mark of refinement. By the 1880s, it was more often a mark of shame. Whispers of dependence carried harsher tones. Writers no longer romanticized the drug as easily. Where De Quincey had once enthralled readers with opium-soaked visions, later accounts emphasized ruin, despair, and decay. What had been described as elegant was now increasingly condemned. Even in the working districts, the change was felt. Soothing syrups for infants, once advertised openly, now drew suspicion. Mothers who used them too freely risked criticism, even legal trouble, where before they had been accepted without question. The cheap comfort of laudanum still tempted families pressed by poverty, but the climate around it was colder. What had once been routine now carried the whisper of danger. And yet, decline did not mean disappearance. Bottles remained in cabinets. Doctors still prescribed it for certain conditions. Writers and thinkers still leaned on it in times of pain or despair. Old habits lingered stubbornly. But laudanum's time at the center of London life was ending. Its reputation, once polished, was now tarnished. Its role, once celebrated, was now quietly receding. The city had changed, and laudanum, once its invisible companion, no longer fit as neatly into its sense of progress. Where it had once symbolized modern medicine, it now symbolized the dangers of misplaced trust. Where it had once united rich and poor alike in silent dependence, it now carried the stain of disrepute. By the end of the century, laudanum still flowed through London's veins, but it was no longer the lifeblood. It was a relic of a time when silence reigned, when poison was sold as medicine, when entire families lived under its shadow without a word of protest. Laudanum's story is, in many ways, a mirror held up to London itself. It began as a promise, a simple mixture of opium and alcohol sold in neat bottles, offered as relief for pain, sleeplessness, grief, and exhaustion. It entered every home, from the richest townhouses to the poorest tenements, and it did so openly, without shame. It was not hidden. It was praised. It was trusted. For more than a century, laudanum defined what medicine meant in Georgian and Victorian society. It was elegance for the wealthy, survival for the poor, and silence for the children who were given its bitter drops. Families built their routines around it. Doctors built their practices upon it. Apothecaries built their fortunes from it. And London, without quite realizing it, built its identity in its shadow. The silence was perhaps the most haunting part. Entire generations grew up under laudanum's influence, yet rarely named it for what it was. They called it weakness, nerves, frailty, but not addiction. They buried infants who never woke, yet blamed fate. They watched women fade into fragility, men collapse under dependence, yet looked away. The city chose not to see, because to see clearly would have been to confront the truth that the trusted remedy was also the quiet destroyer. In time, a silence cracked. Doctors began to speak more plainly. Laws tightened. Public opinion shifted. What had once been a symbol of progress became a cautionary tale. By the end of the 19th century, laudanum's reign was fading. It was no longer fashionable, no longer ordinary, no longer respectable. The bottle remained, but its aura was gone. And yet, laudanum left behind more than faded labels and empty vials. It left questions that echo even now. How often do societies embrace something harmful, not because they do not know better, but because it is easier to remain silent? How often do comfort and habit blind us to danger? Georgian London was not uniquely foolish. It was simply human seeking relief, seeking calm, trusting what was sold, and carrying on as though dependency were nothing more than weakness of character. As we close this journey, imagine the city once more. The lamplight flickers on damp cobblestones, carriages rattle in the fog, and behind countless doors, families measure drops into spoons. Some do so with elegance, others with desperation, but all with trust. Trust in a bitter liquid that dulled pain and blurred lives for generations. Laudanum is no longer on every shelf, but its story lingers, a reminder of how easily medicine can become poison, how silence can shape entire societies, and how the line between remedy and ruin is often thinner than we wish to admit.